I had a conversation with someone recently about rankings in boxing. Shout out to him. And this weren't some idiot, this was someone who I like and respect. And the conversation was pertaining to who Tyson Fury should be fighting in voluntary defenses of his title. My position is this: Tyson Fury is the WBC World Heavyweight Champion and the self-proclaimed best heavyweight of his generation and greatest heavyweight of all time. So Fury's saying that he's greater than Muhammad Ali, greater than Joe Louis, Lennox Lewis, Mike Tyson, all of them. And all these guys were undisputed. They cleaned out the division for all the top contenders. Ali had something like 25 world title fights. Therefore, it's only fair that we hold Tyson Fury to that standard. But Fury, of course, has shown no intention of living up to that standard. He's only had 6 world title fights, and 3 of them were against the same guy. He also ducked the undisputed fight twice. Yet he claims to be greater than all the fighters I just mentioned. The least he can do to try and justify his position as champion and justify all his talk is to fight the highest ranked available contender each time he makes a voluntary defense. That's the least he can do, bare minimum. At the time of having the conversation with this person, the highest ranked available contender in the WBC rankings was Frank Sanchez. However, the person I was talking to felt that it was unfair to expect Fury to fight Frank Sanchez or Martin Bakole, Makhmudov, etc., and that it was perfectly justified for Fury to skip over all these guys and pick someone much lower in the rankings, such as Ajit Kabayel, instead. His explanation was that Sanchez and co hadn't earned their rankings and therefore didn't deserve a title shot. He believes that Kabayel's win over Derek Chisora 6 years ago means that he deserves a shot more than they do. Well, let me explain a few things about rankings and how they work before I give my response. In every weight division, there are literally thousands of active fighters. In the heavyweight division specifically, it's roughly 1,300. The sanctioning bodies don't rank all those fighters. They only rank the top 15. So how on earth do you whittle 1,300 fighters down to just 15? You're obviously not going to go through all their records and watch all their fights. That would be absurd logistically. So the way they actually do it is primarily through lobbying, through ranking matches, and of course the obligatory payment of sanctioning fees. Lobbying is where the manager or the promoter of the fighter contacts the sanctioning body and puts forward a case for their fighter to receive a certain ranking. And this may be based on a number of factors, such as the quality of opposition, how active they've been, and so on. Bear in mind, there are multiple fighters lobbying a sanctioning body at any given time in each weight class. So the sanctioning body is having to look at all these different cases and compare all their pros and cons to decide who should be ranked where, whose case is convincing and whose case isn't. And this is where ranking matches come into play. These are fights that are either arranged by or approved by a sanctioning body where the winner is guaranteed a certain ranking. Oftentimes, these fights will be for a regional belt of some sort, like the EBU title, or one of these secondary belts that the sanctioning bodies have, like silver belts and what have you. So those are the 2 main ways that rankings are determined. And in order to be eligible for any of this, you have to pay sanctioning fees. There are some other factors that help determine rankings, such as the sanctioning body's own discernment, obviously, but I've highlighted the main ones. Now, this should go without saying, but rankings are subjective to some degree. There is no such thing as a definitive top 10. You might, at the very best, have a definitive top 2 or 3, but outside of that, it starts to get more subjective. So you accept a certain amount of subjectivity, as long as it's reasonable. You can split hairs over whether certain guys deserve to be ranked a position or 2 higher or lower, but that can get overly pedantic and downright silly. As long as a fighter's ranking falls within the realms of reasonable subjectivity, then there's no need to make a fuss over it. And there's no justification for a champion to skip over that fighter and pick someone else much lower down the rankings instead. And again, the criteria you base a fighter's ranking on is the quality of their recent wins and how active they've been. If a fighter had a good win 5 years ago, but he's done nothing since, he will typically and rightfully be dropped down the rankings or removed from the rankings completely. An example of that would be Michael Hunter. He beat Martin Bakole 5 years ago. Bakole is currently ranked number 2 by the WBA, whereas Hunter fighter isn't even in the top 15 of any of the sanctioning bodies. This is because he's been inactive and his recent opposition has been poor, so they rightfully dropped him out. An example of an unreasonable ranking would be Sergio Martinez being ranked number 3 by the WBA at middleweight. He's nearly 50 years old and he hasn't fought anyone with a pulse in nearly a decade. His last fight was against the guy coming off a knockout loss who'd only beaten 2 people in his entire career that had winning records. His opponent before that was a guy with a record of 6-6-2, and his opponent before that was a journeyman from the UK. So you get the picture. Giving Martinez a number 3 ranking is absurd. Most of the people ranked below him have fought much better opposition over the past 12 months than he has. So if the WBA champion decided to skip over Martinez and fight the number 4 ranked guy instead, most of us would agree that it would be perfectly justified because Martinez's ranking falls way beyond the bounds of reasonable subjectivity. Another example of a ridiculous ranking is Deontay Wilder being ranked number 1 by the WBC and WBA at heavyweight. He only has 1 win in the past 3 years, and that was over Robert Helenius. It is absurd for him to be ranked above people who've been more active and who've beaten better opposition in the past 12 or even 18 months. There are many more examples I could give of ridiculous rankings, but I'll leave it at 2 for now. An example of perfectly reasonable rankings would be Frank Sanchez and Arslanbek Makhmudov. And this brings us back onto the conversation I mentioned earlier. Sanchez beat Efe Ajagba in a ranking match back in 2021 for which he received a high ranking. But he's recently been dropped down 1 place, and the guy who was previously below him, Arslanbek Makhmudov, has taken his spot. The person I was having the discussion with was under the assumption that the WBC did that purely based on the result of Makhmudov's last fight, which was a win over Rafael Akpajori. The person felt that that was grossly unjustified and showed what a joke the rankings are, apparently implying that it's therefore perfectly okay for Tyson Fury to disregard the order of the rankings completely and pick whoever he wants to fight from the top 15 in an arbitrary fashion, which is exactly what Fury did for his last voluntary defense when he picked Derek Chisora, who was ranked about 12 or 13 at the time and was totally washed up. Tyson Fury likes to pick low-hanging fruit, and he will continue to do so unless there's sufficient public pressure on him to do otherwise. Sanctioning bodies don't update their rankings immediately after every fight. They update them roughly once a month, sometimes 6 weeks. And as I explained earlier, the promoters are constantly lobbying the sanctioning bodies, presenting the case for their fighters based on numerous criteria, such as activity and the quality of their most recent wins. Plural. It isn't necessarily based on who they beat in their last fight alone. Makhmudov has fought 3 times in the past 12 months against Akpajori, Michael Wallish, and Carlos Takam, whereas Frank Sanchez has only fought twice in that same period against Daniel Martz and Carlos Negron. So Makhmudov has been more active, and you could certainly argue that he's beaten better opposition over the past 12 months than Frank Sanchez has. Don't get me wrong, there's not much in it, but again, we're splitting hairs here. Makhmudov has only been moved up 1 position and Sanchez down 1 position. This isn't some dramatic change here. It's still well within the realms of reasonable subjectivity, meaning I may not necessarily agree with it, but it's reasonable, so there's no need to make a fuss about it. This brings me on to Ajit Kabayel. He's currently ranked number 12 by the WBC. Yes, he did beat Derek Chisora, but that was 6 years ago. The more time that elapses since your last significant win, the less influence it has on your current ranking. That's how it typically works, and that's how it should work. You can't be dining out forever on a win you had 6 years ago. That would be ridiculous. You have to build on that win if you want to continue climbing up the ranks. But Kabayel has only fought once a year since that Chisora fight. Yup, he has fought just once a year for the past 6 years in a row. So he's very inactive. And his opposition has been absolutely terrible. He hasn't beaten anyone anywhere near as good as Carlos Takam or Efe Ajagba in the past 4 years. Never mind the past 12 months. There is just no way you could reasonably argue that he should be ranked above Sanchez or Makhmudov at this point. In fact, the only reason Kabayel hasn't been removed from the top 15 altogether is because he has the EBU belt. That belt is recognized by certain sanctioning bodies as a ranking belt, so whoever holds it automatically gets ranked in the top 15, irrespective of their quality of opposition. Caballel is extremely fortunate that he's been allowed to defend that belt against horrendous opposition over the past few years, because that's probably the only thing keeping him in the top 15. So this brings us back to Mr. Fury, the current WBC World Heavyweight Champion and the self-proclaimed greatest heavyweight in history. The question here is not, what have Sanchez or Makhmudov or even Bacoli done to deserve a shot against him? None of these guys are mandatory anyway. None of them have a guaranteed shot. The question is, what justification could Tyson Fury possibly have for skipping over all these guys in the rankings to fight someone much lower down on the list like Ajit Caballel? And of course, there is no justification. This isn't a Sergio Martinez situation. Makhmudov, Sanchez, and Bacoli all have perfectly reasonable rankings within the WBC top 15. It's Caballel down here at number 12 who actually has the most generous ranking, all things considered. Now, the person I was having the discussion with also took issue with the fact that Tyson Fury was criticized for fighting Otto Wallin a few years ago when Wallin had a decent ranking at the time. Therefore, he felt the criticism was unjustified. But the reality, of course, is that it was the context in which Tyson Fury took that fight that people had an issue with, not the actual fight itself necessarily. On the face of it, there was nothing wrong with the fight. Fury didn't have a belt at the time, so it was one contender fighting another contender. No problem with that whatsoever. The issue was that Fury was calling himself world champion, and he sold the Wallin fight and the Schwartz fight as world title defenses on pay-per-view. Furthermore, he was called out by Dylan White earlier that same year. White was ranked higher and was on a very good run of form at the time. This was back in 2019. Fury initially accepted the challenge on the condition that the WBC Diamond Belt was on the line. The WBC agreed, but then Fury went back on his word and fought Tom Schwartz and Otto Wallin instead. That is why Tyson Fury got so much stick. It was the context in which he took the Wallin fight. He was running around calling himself champion when he didn't have a belt, then went back on his word when the number one contender challenged him and instead fought a lower ranked contender who no one had ever heard of. Fury brings all this stuff on himself by running his mouth, making all these bold claims, then refusing to back it up. The public are not gonna like that. They feel like they're being conned. Anyway, hopefully I got my points across and shed some light on the way rankings work. I could go more in depth about bad rankings with people like Martinez and Wilder and many others, as well as the mandatory system and the biases that sometimes come with that. An example being the current situation with Wilder and Andy Ruiz, with the WBC refusing to order a purse bid or replace the fighters with two guys who are actually ready to fight, and so on. I might do a part 2 and cover all that if you guys are interested, but for now, I'll leave it there. Are you sick and tired of the mainstream mindset? Does the dogmatic conformity and pathological ignorance have you tearing your hair out in frustration? Then don't be alone. Come and join our brotherhood on Patreon. We stand as a beacon of reason against an army of insanity. You'll gain access to my weekly topical podcast where we take more deep dives than Jacques Cousteau on an endless variety of subjects. There's also videos, interviews, live Q&As, as well as a vast back catalogue of previous episodes, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen via the Patreon app or download in high-quality MP3. Connect with myself and hundreds of other members in our Element chat group. There's no contract, no commitment, you can cancel at any time, and it's cheaper than a Mickey D's McMuffin. Just head to my Patreon page via the link below this video and select the tier called the Brotherhood of Reason. I'll see you over there.